Hey, today we're gonna take a bit of a departure because, usually we talk about, political avenues of change or, exploration as a means of change. We usually in history, for some reason, we kind of neglect the scientific aspects of change. And so we're gonna address some of that a little bit today. And the big thing that we're going to build up to in this lecture is the discovery and widespread adoption of the use of penicillin as a means of treating some diseases. It doesn't work for everything by a long shot, but prior to the advent of penicillin, uh, a lot of things, a lot more things would kill people than afterwards. So we're going to address that a bit today. A big date for this is 1928. 1928, a Scottish biologist, a guy named Alexander Fleming, returned from vacation to clean up his lab. Prior to his vacation, he was working with Staphylococci bacterium, which, in a lot of cases causes strep throat, but there's a lot of other staph infections that are pretty nasty to deal with. We're seeing a resurgence of those, unfortunately, with a lot of antibiotic resistant strains of staph infections. But anyway, September 3rd of 1928, he had placed a lot of trays of and contaminated trays, petri dishes with various bacteriums in those. And he was leaving for vacation. He placed a lot of those in antiseptic fluids. Some of the trays were not all the way immersed in the fluid, and so some of them were left out. And he left for vacation. He left for upwards of a week, I think. Went on vacation, and when he got back, he noticed that in one of the top dishes that wasn't immersed in that antiseptic fluid, a greenish yellow mold had developed in one of the open areas. And what was really cool is that he looked at it under a microscope and he saw that, where the mold was, there was sort of a perimeter that the bacterium was, getting up to the mold. It was growing up to the mold, and then it was dying off. It was breaking down as it was getting near the mold. So the mold was producing something that was causing that bacterium to break down and die. And he termed that penicillin notatum. Uh, and, you know, this gets the common usage of the word penicillin. Um, and this starts us on a huge road, new road for medicine. We have a new weapon against a lot of disease. But, a lot of times when we do discuss that, we just say, hey, penicillin's discovered and things change radically. But, this is not, developing in a vacuum. There's a lot of mechanisms that kind of lead to this discovery. It's not just that, Fleming discovers penicillin and no one else had even thought to work with this kind of things. This has all been building. All the way back in 1676, another biologist had discovered microorganisms. Later after that, in 1847, a German-Hungarian medical doctor, Dr. Semmelweis, sorry, he had made a horrific discovery in 1847. This is a very huge discovery. He noticed that in some of the maternity wards that he observed, some of them had dramatic differences in mother mortality rates. In one of these maternity wards, it had a 29% mortality rates for new mothers, and they really didn't know what was going on. They just called this childbed fever. Women, were giving birth, and they developed a fever when in their child birthing beds and died. And another one of the maternity wards that Semmelweis had observed, though, had a 3% mortality rate. That's just something's wrong there. And he investigated the disparity, and he noted that in the ward with 29% mortality rate, what was going on is that there were a lot of medical students delivering children, babies in that ward. And while they weren't delivering babies, they were doing their studies. And doing their studies, a big part of that was dissecting cadavers. And so they were doing autopsies, dissecting cadavers, and then going directly to deliver babies. And they weren't washing their hands in between these things. So you've got, infectious diseases and bacterium and viruses in these cadavers, and then you're directly transferring them to these new mothers. He ordered intensive hand washing for all of the medical students that were going from the autopsy labs into the maternity wards, and child bed fever dropped by about 90%. And so we know that there's some kind of avenue of transmission, something's going on here. A few years after that, a couple of decades actually almost, in 1865, Joseph Lister, that name should sound slightly familiar to you, developed an antiseptic surgical procedure. We're going to mist all of the instruments and all of the surrounding tissue with a mild carbolic acid. And the reasoning behind this, the logic, is that we're going to try to inhibit any kind of infection. That mild carbolic acid is going to kill any kind of, easier to kill viruses, bacterium, stuff like that. And so we're going to sterilize things. Listerine is named as a tribute to Joseph Lister, making that kind of discovery. And so following that movement, we have sort of a worldwide reform movement towards cleanliness. There's an understanding that, hey, the more clean we are, the more we can kind of inhibit diseases. A big breakthrough comes with Louis Pasteur. He is going to note that pasteurization, heating various foods and liquids to a higher temperature, kills off microbes. That kills off the microbes and makes things last longer, preserves food longer. He also arrives at a conclusion that we can develop some vaccines through some weakened versions of those bacteria. He starts with anthrax, develops a vaccine for anthrax. He also develops a vaccine for rabies. This is remarkable. Rabies, if left untreated, has a 100% fatality rate. If you get bitten by a rabid animal and you develop rabies, if we don't do anything about it, you will 100% die. That's it. There's nothing to it. But Pasteur develops the first treatment for rabies. He develops this in 1885. And that year, 350 people are treated at his clinic. Remarkably, 4 kids even come from the United States, go to France, to Paris, France. People are crossing an ocean to obtain a vaccine, a treatment for penicillin. And it works. It works fantastically. In that first year, of those 350 people that were treated in Pasteur's lab, only 1 person died of rabies. So we're figuring out that, hey, these are typically the vectors for disease. We're developing germ theory, the idea that germs are the cause of diseases usually. And that, Pasteur develops this 1885-ish, and by about 1900, it really takes hold among the public. Unfortunately, the public sometimes is a little bit slow to, accept new medical knowledge, new scientific knowledge. We see that today. Things like global warming, a lot of the world's public, just it's not scientific. We don't accept that. We don't want to change the way we're doing things. So the public sometimes is a bit slow on this. The public's a bit slow on accepting medical knowledge as well sometimes. And so back to Fleming. Um, Fleming was working with penicillin, like we said, uh, and this wasn't just a pure accident. What was kind of cool is that Fleming was up on the second floor, had a lab on the second floor of this medical building. He wasn't working with any kind of molds or funguses. He actually had a bad cold, and he was up on the second floor before his vacation, and he had some nasal drippage, and he allowed some of that nasal mucus to drip into one of these petri dishes. It's probably got some kind of something growing in there, and so he allowed that to develop. What's remarkable, though, is when he left on vacation, as I said, he's not working with molds or funguses. A lab on the first floor is working with molds and funguses, and Fleming left his window open when he left for vacation. The lab on the first floor had their windows open, and some of those spores just drifted out that first floor window into his window and landed in those petri dishes. This is a complete remarkable accident. And he tries this out. He grows this mold spore, and noted that it it continues to kill off different bacteriums. He tries it out on some rabbits and mice. It seems to work okay, and then wildly, okay, this is another one of those just bizarre, kind of off the wall things, but it does have some logic to it. In 1932, he had made this discovery back in 28. By 1932, he's giving up on working with it. It seems to be working. It is a discovery, and he stops work on penicillin. Part of the reason for this is that producing something like this large scale was outside of his lab's ability. Also, Fleming was mainly a researcher. He was, interested in making new discoveries, writing these things up, and moving on to the next discovery. Somebody else would take over for him. And so penicillin just kind of drops off the radar for several years. So a number of years later, a couple of researchers from Oxford University continue the program. They purify penicillin, and get more and more production out of it. And the big, gigantic turning point comes in 1942. 1942 in, I believe she was in New York. I'm not sure. We'll have to look it up, though. Somebody look this up. But in 1942, a woman in the United States was hospitalized with a streptococcal infection, strep throat. She literally did have strep throat. And she was at death's door. She had a fever of 107. She was drifting in and out of consciousness. And it looked like she was on the way out. She was almost dead. And her doctors got a small sample of penicillin out of a lab in New Jersey, and they injected it into this woman, sort of a last-ditch effort. She's about to die. We're going to try anything. And they injected her with penicillin, and her fever drops. The next morning, she felt a lot better, and she ultimately recovered. This lady's name was Ann Miller. Check this out. This is remarkable. This is the first patient ever to be saved by penicillin. She died at 90 years old in 1999. So most of you, I'm making this video in 2019. Most of you were around possibly in 1999. So this is how recent this development came about. In 1950, broad spectrum antibiotics are developed. These are other kind of antibiotics that aren't treated, that work for diseases that aren't treated by penicillin. Sorry, I got that kind of jumbled a little bit. And these things work remarkably. Unfortunately, we as a not super intelligent species sometimes, we develop sort of an overconfidence of antibiotics. And some folks, a lot of people were not taking their antibiotics, the entire script. The doctor gives you a script for 30 days, take these antibiotics, whether you feel better or not. A lot of people would feel better and they would stop taking their antibiotics. Hey, next time I get sick, I've got some antibiotics hanging around. Well, what happens there is you're killing off a lot of the bacterium, but you're not killing all of it off. And then, those bacterium that are still alive are going to be resistant to that strain of antibiotics. And so they're going to multiply and they get out of your body and go out into the world. And so we've sort of created these antibiotic resistant bacterium out of that sort of overconfidence that people have. Similar thing is happening with vaccines. Vaccines have been used to treat a tremendous amount of diseases remarkably well. We've gotten rid of polio in this country. Unfortunately, some people have started claiming that there's a negative impact of disease through a lot of misinformation, incorrectly claiming that some vaccines cause autism. They don't. And so now we're at the point in 2019 where we're having to make a big concerted push that vaccines are a positive thing, people. So you've unfortunately got these, what I term polio enthusiasts, some people call them plague enthusiasts as well, are claiming that, vaccines aren't really workable. I've seen a lot of people claim that, measles is actually good for you. I've heard arguments claiming that polio is not actually an infectious disease. It seriously is. Go and look at some pictures of some kids in iron lungs and stuff if you want to really get a good sense of what polio can do to you. And so science, in sort of an ironic twist, it's been so well developed and so successful in dealing with some of these diseases that there's almost an anti-science movement brewing in the United States, especially, and in some places the rest of the world. So anyway, go and take your antibiotics and listen to doctors, medical doctors and stuff. They'll help you out. Thanks. Bye.